It's hard to believe that it's been 13 years since I started playing WoW, but I have played a Holy Paladin since the summer of 2005. As such, I knew that I had to make a video about Blizzard's idea of making vanilla servers. It's freaking obligatory. It's hard to find a class that has changed more in the last 13 years than Paladins, for one thing, and for another, I have seen so much change in the last 13 years. The features that the game offers, the difficulty of the content, the types of content, class flavor, Blizzard's attitudes and their philosophies. All of them have seen significant changes over the years, and there are actually some things that Vanilla offered us that Legion didn't, and can't. As such, I know I need to discuss it. And if you've watched my videos, you know how this is going to go. I start out talking about general stuff, but eventually I start talking about Paladins, and then I go on about them at length. Well, actually, I think that's exactly what a video about vanilla servers ought to do, seeing as how Paladins were very, very badly designed in vanilla. But, let's talk about the general stuff first. First of all, the main thing that comes to my mind when I think about the differences between vanilla and now was the sheer difficulty of the content. For crying out loud, you had off-tanks in 5-man dungeons back in those days. You also used crowd control a lot. Rogues would use distract to make targets turn around and then they'd sap them. Hunters would carefully pull and lure an enemy onto their freezing trap. Mages were expected to use polymorph. The list goes on. Also, tanks did not have much along the line of AoE. Thunderclap was battle stance only for warriors. Paladins couldn't tank at all at the time, and even if they could, Consecration was neither a protection talent nor baseline. Also, it was pretty easy to lose aggro, probably partly because of the fact that tanks didn't have much along the lines of AoE. As a healing paladin in vanilla, I remember feeling awesome when I used my Hammer of Justice ability to stun an enemy that was running at our warlocks and mages. That gave the tanks a little extra time so that they could charge the enemy and regain aggro. I saved our 10-man group multiple times that way. Also, in these 5-mans, if you accidentally pulled an extra group of enemies, you wiped. That was it. That's right, you could actually wipe pretty easily in a 5-man dungeon back in vanilla. And on top of this, there weren't much along the lines of matchmaking tools at the time either. I think there might have been some for player versus player in Battlegrounds, but the way I remember it, you either had to have friends or be in a guild or both if you wanted to run dungeons. Because if you didn't, you had to spam the Looking for Group channel. That's right, Looking for Group was a chat channel back in those days, not an auto-matchmaking service. And you had to spam that channel saying where you wanted to go and cross your fingers. It's possible, or I should say it was possible back in those days, to spam that for hours and still not get to your dungeon. Now, all that may seem like it was horrible, but the fact is there were some huge silver linings that this environment of difficulty and lack of auto-matchmaking caused. Probably the biggest silver lining was camaraderie. You liked hanging out with your guildmates and your friends online. You really got to know them, their playstyle, their strengths, their personalities. Joking with them and seeing them being funny or cute or friendly online felt fun. And that was actually part of the fun that was World of Warcraft back in vanilla. It almost felt at the time like World of Warcraft was an online chat with friendly people on it that happened to have a game attached to it that you could sometimes play. It was a very social experience back in vanilla. And another thing that came out of all this difficulty and inaccessibility was a sheer sense of accomplishment when you got even a blue in a dungeon. Since everything was so difficult, having a purple in your gear really meant something. It was actually possible to enter a raid with blues or even a few greens back in those days. Nowadays, purples are basically everywhere. So back in vanilla, when you had purples, it meant that you were pushing into a frontier of difficulty. Personally, I think that when most people talk about nostalgia for WoW, it's the camaraderie and the sense of accomplishment that they're looking back at. And the fact is, you can't have those things without the difficulty, and you can't have them with things like the Looking for Group or Looking for Raid system. So, I agree with other players who are saying those things should not be added to the game. One thing that I find myself disagreeing about with the majority of players is class design. There were some huge class design issues, especially with the Paladin class, and if Blizzard wants the Paladin class in these vanilla servers to be fun to play and effective at tanking, then they are going to need to make some pretty big class design changes in order for that to happen. Looking back on vanilla now, there are some things that I realized today that I did not realize at the time I was working on the Does Blizzard Really Hate Paladins series. I think I've realized what it was that made Blizzard developers so reluctant to touch the Paladin class, despite the fact that back in 2005 there were in-game online protests called the Pally Rally to try to get the developers to fix the class. Surprisingly, I think one of the things that made Paladins so powerful was actually their heals. Those heals were very powerful even before you take talents and gear into account. And when you consider that we have shields and plate as well as those powerful heals, our defense bordered on overpowered, and that created a few meta problems. I think that having that strong of defense actually put Paladins on the razor's edge between overpowered and underpowered. If the developers added one little thing like a strike ability, it would have pushed Paladins deep into the overpowered territory and made the game less fun for everybody. But at the same time, if they took one teeny tiny thing away from Paladins, it would push Paladins into underpowered territory. As it was, with that strong of defense, Paladins sat in an ambiguous place between overpowered and underpowered, overlapping with both in different ways, and that made the developers extremely reluctant to touch the class. And having such a huge defense meant that we could not have any on-demand damage abilities, or else we'd be pushed into overpowered territory. Instead of things like strikes, we had chance-on-hit melee buffs called seals. At the time, Judgment consumed these self-buffs and turned them into debuffs. Some of these debuffs were absolutely terrific and I kind of missed them, others were jokes. Considering that we had something that doesn't actually require any player interaction in lieu of strike abilities, in the end, it was not a fun class to play. You press something, wait 30 seconds, and basically don't do anything in that time. Pressing buttons is way more fun than doing nothing. And on top of those issues, the Paladin talent trees at the time made no sense. Talents that would help in tanking, such as Consecration or Improved Retribution Aura, weren't in protection and were difficult to get if you wanted to spec protection. And talents that were vital for tanking, such as Holy Shield, were placed too deep in the trees, especially after patch 1.9. And keep in mind that patch 1.9 was supposed to be the Paladin improvement patch. We were crossing our fingers that all of these issues would be solved in that patch, but Blizzard basically just rearranged our talents and left us as broken or even more broken than we were before, with only a few minor things that actually improved. Another issue with Paladins in terms of class design was a lack of ranged damage. At the time, Blizzard was much more concerned about their vision for what the class should be, rather than whether the class was fun to play or even playable. The fact is, ranged damage is absolutely vital for tanking. At least it was at the time, to get enemies to come to you. Remember that because of all this difficulty, positioning was crucial. Due to the lack of on-demand damage abilities and the lack of range damage and the problems with the talent trees, Paladins, in the end, could not tank in vanilla. And don't even get me started on the problems with gear. Blizzard really didn't build much along the lines of itemized gear that would help Paladins tank. Things like increased spell damage and mana per 5, those sorts of things did not appear on plate alongside defense until the Burning Crusade. Probably a big part of this was the fact that Shaman were Horde only and Paladins were Alliance only, and if the Alliance had access to an extra tanking class that the Horde couldn't have, yeah, I can see how there would be some kind of imbalance there, but still, if you're going to create a protection tree, you should allow the class that has that tree to frickin' tank! In any case, the lack of range damage and the lack of on-demand damage abilities also meant, which was even worse considering that WoW is supposed to be a game, it also meant that the Paladin class was not fun to play. And honestly, that should be an even bigger issue, an even more important issue that Blizzard has to fix if they're going to create vanilla servers. With all that context in mind, I've done a lot of thinking, and I think I know how to fix Paladins in vanilla so that they are a much more balanced class and much more fun to play. First and foremost, the power of healing should be rebalanced. The heals should be much suckier at baseline, probably costing more mana and not healing for as much. But then holy talents should be able to bring that healing back up to par. Another thing that's important is the effect of Blessing of Light. That was a paladin blessing that just plain increased the effect of your heals. I think that the effect of Blessing of Light should be moved into the talent trees. The way I would implement it is make it a talent that boosts healing by a percentage if there is at least one paladin blessing on the target. My first thought was just put Blessing of Light in there as a talent, but the fact is that would just lock holy paladins into using just that one blessing. Another idea, maybe move Lay on Hands into the talent tree. Another thing that would be a good idea is to make shallow holy talents the efficiency talents that reduce the cost of the heals, or things like the old school illumination spell. Then the stuff that's deeper in the holy tree could be things that increase the power of your heals. Now, in order to make paladins viable tanks, there's no two ways about it. Paladins are going to need strike abilities, the ability to do holy damage when we need it and not randomly. With the healing nerfed like that, it should be possible to add strikes to the paladin class in vanilla without making them overpowered. Removing Seal of Righteousness and Seal of the Crusader and replacing them with Holy Strike and Crusader Strike respectively from the beta version of World of Warcraft from 2003 would be a good idea. At the time, Crusader Strike had no cooldown and granted a plus holy damage stacking debuff on the enemy, while Holy Strike was on a 6-second cooldown and made your next melee attack deal holy damage and do a little extra damage on top of what the swing would have otherwise done. In general, we're going to need more on-demand damage. Making Holy Shock baseline would help a lot. Its place could be filled in the Holy Talent tree by Light of Dawn, or better yet, Fist of the Heavens from Diablo 2, dealing holy damage to an enemy and radiating healing to nearby allies. I think that we need at least one more on-demand damage ability in the protection tree. Avenger's Shield might work. Making Consecration baseline has some dangers involved. I already talked about what the lack of AoE damage did for the difficulty, and making Consecration baseline might mean that it's a little bit too easy. One thing I definitely recommend is adding Holy Bolt to the Paladin's repertoire at baseline. That would be a ranged damage spell with no cooldown. Maybe add some talents to allow the Paladin to dodge, block, and parry while casting it. Also, revamp the Redoubt talent so that it no longer procs when we get a critical hit on us, because getting critically hit is something you want to avoid in your itemization. Making it on demand, or maybe something that you get after you cast Holy Strike or Avenger's Shield, might be a better idea. Another thing in general for Blizzard to keep in mind is that buffs in talent trees are not interesting to players. What's interesting are things that go boom. On-demand damage abilities or self-buffs that make an interesting difference in gameplay. At the time, the developers saw differences in healing, damage, and mitigation in buffs like Blessing of Kings, and they made the crucial mistake of thinking that if they thought it was awesome, then someone playing the game would also think it's awesome. No dice. In general, Blizzard should revamp the talent trees and keep this golden cardinal rule in mind. Buffs in talent trees are boring. Give Discipline Priests Power Word Solace, but don't put Divine Spirit in there. Give Paladins Divine Sacrifice, but don't put Blessing of Kings or Blessing of Sanctuary in the protection tree. In my opinion, Holy Shield should be the 21-point talent, Avenger's Shield should be the 31-point talent, and maybe Blessing of Protection should be an 11-pointer. Yeah, it's a buff, but it's an interesting and game-changing one, and we need to nerf Paladin defenses in order to give them the offensive capabilities they need to be effective at tanking and fun to play. Another idea, allow Tauren Paladins and Dwarf Shaman. I realize that they didn't enter the game until Cataclysm, but the fact is, doing a retcon and having those available in vanilla would allow Blizzard to do class redesigns without having to worry about Horde Alliance balance. On the subject of Shaman, one last thought. Shaman insisted that their class was pretty sucky at the time. Their buff system sucked compared to Paladins, though their on-demand damage repertoire was much better. I am not the right person to ask what should be done with the Shaman class, but probably something should. I sure hope there's a veteran Shaman player who can fill in this gap for me.